In this section, we'll work on yet another demo project, and it will be a demo project that will allow us to dive a bit deeper into components, their templates, managing data in components, and all those other related concepts. Because in this section, we'll build up on the foundation we got over the previous sections, and we'll dive into more advanced component features and concepts. Therefore, by the way, we will not focus on building this demo application as quickly as possible. Instead, we'll just use it as a dummy application to dive into all those advanced concepts and to explore some advanced concepts in an actual project. Specifically, we'll, for example, have a look at how we can work with a component's host element, what that actually is, and why it can sometimes be interesting to work with that. We'll revisit the idea of inputs and outputs and two-way binding, and we'll explore advanced configuration options and also how you can set up custom two-way binding on your own components so that certain properties on your own components can be two-way bound if needed. We'll explore how you can interact with a component's view and content and why you might want to do that and what exactly I mean with interaction here. We'll explore the life cycle of a component and how you can hook into certain life cycle stages and much more. And therefore, let's dive right in and let's get started with these more advanced concepts now. Now, for this section, I prepared another starting project, which you find attached. And this project actually already comes with some code. It comes with an app component that already contains some data and that has a template where some data is output. Now, in order to work on that demo project, after downloading it, you should run npm install in that extracted project folder to install the dependencies that are needed to run this project. As you learned, this command only needs to be executed once initially. And thereafter, you should run npm start to start that development server. And if you then visit localhost 4200, or whichever address is showing up for you when you ran npm start, you should see this dummy application on the screen. And that's not the finished application. We'll work on it throughout this section, but it's a starting state on which we'll build up on. Now, I'll also say right away that there's a lot of dummy content in here, like this navigation here. We'll not yet add multiple pages here. That's something we'll do in a later course section. Instead, in this section, as mentioned, we'll focus on diving a bit deeper into components and component-related features. And indeed, in this starting project, which I prepared for you, there already is one component-related question I want to answer together with you. Because if you take a look at this app component HTML file, you see that it contains quite a bit of markup. Definitely not horrible, but it has a lot of content in there. And the first question I want to answer together with you is when exactly you should split up a component into multiple components. So how do you decide what should go into a separate component? Because after all, you could theoretically put all your markup and all your logic into one single component, as it's currently the case here. But the question is whether that's a good idea. So when should you split up a component? How do you decide what should go into a separate component? And the simple answer is that it's of course up to you. But one of the main ideas behind this component concept in Angular, but also in other libraries and frameworks like React, is that you can separate concerns, which means that every component typically should only do one thing. Now, of course, you can define one thing in pretty different ways. You could argue that this app component here does only one thing because it renders this one page, which outputs this fictional server data. But of course, you could also argue that it's doing multiple things. It's outputting this header here, and then it's outputting 3 dashboard items, which are about different things. This first dashboard item here outputs some server status. This second item shows us some made up traffic over the last couple of days. And this item, which is not complete yet, will allow us to open and manage support tickets. So if you look at it like this component is not doing one thing, but 4 things. So therefore, it might make sense to split up this one component into 4 components. Now, of course, depending on the complexity of your website, and this here, for example, is of course a pretty simple dummy web application, you might prefer to not create a bunch of component files, even though you are technically doing different things. But if you then have 4 super simple components which barely contain any code, it might have been better to leave them all in one component. So in the end, it's also a trade-off and comes down to your personal preferences. You have this separation of concerns principle, and therefore you might want to create very granular, small components and work with many components. But at the same time, you sometimes might end up with a simpler application and more simplicity if you co-locate your code. So ultimately, there is no clear right or wrong, and it will always depend on your preferences, on the preferences or guidelines of the team you're working in, and on the complexity of the application you're working on. Because, of course, theoretically, you could make every paragraph its own component, but that wouldn't make a lot of sense. You don't want to be that granular. At the same time, working with just 1 or 2 components is typically also not a good idea, especially as your application becomes more complex. Therefore, my suggestion is that you try to identify the main thing a component does, or the main things that are currently happening in one of your components, and you then split those main things into separate components. And that's what I'll do now in this application. I'll put this header into a separate component, and then I'll put all those dashboard items into separate components. And of course, as an exercise, you can do that. You can try that on your own. Try creating those 4 components I outlined before, and try migrating the HTML code that belongs to these different components into these new components. In the next lecture, we'll do it together.